Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. The topic that set the internet on fire this week, and I guess for the past 2.5 years, is what motivates Viktor Orban to be so pro-Russian and so anti-Ukrainian? And generally, how can his Hungary lean towards Russia based on the history they've had? Today with me, I have Stefano Bottoni, who's going to help us answer this question.
My name is Stefano Bottoni. I am an associate professor of history at the University of Florence. My field of expertise is mostly Central Eastern Europe in the 20th century. I have worked extensively on Romania and then Hungary. I'm partially of Hungarian origin, so Hungary is not only a field of study for me, but it's also part of my personal story. I teach in Italy, but I have a work experience in Hungary as well. I have been for more than 10 years a researcher at the Institute of History of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences.
Yeah, well, this is amazing. Then you're a perfect person to talk about Hungary with, right? So I guess what we are trying to understand here in Ukraine is what is Orban's motivation for being so close to Russia and being so against Ukraine, given that I guess Hungarian history against Russia is more similar, or Hungarian history with Russia is more similar with Ukraine. And I guess the Hungarian struggle for freedom back in the day it echoes what Ukraine is doing now. So it's very strange for us to see Hungary being so supportive of Russia and so unsupportive of us.
I can tell you that it is very strange for me too, because we don't have a sure answer. Mm-hmm. So the answer I will try to give you is a very tentative one, based on so-called educated guesses, based on observations, based not always on documents, because we don't know precisely what happened to him over the last 10, 15 years in order for him to change mind quite radically about Russia. Because the most important thing to note is that he was not always like this. To put it bluntly. So he started his career not only as a young Western-trained liberal and a protege of George Soros, but more importantly, he was part of that Hungarian right-wing or conservative or liberal conservative thinking for which Russia is basically a source of bad things. It has been like this in 1848 and 1849, so the big Hungarian Revolution of the 19th century. It has been like this after the First World War, when there was a Bolshevik attempt in Hungary, the so-called Republic of Councils, led by Béla Kun, 1919, and then the Second World War, when Hungary attacked, in fact, the Soviet Union along with the German troops. And then in 1944-45, the actual territory of Hungary became a huge spot of violence, and the liberation of the Red Army was, in fact, a very brutal occupation as well. And then we had, of course, what all you know very well, the Soviet bloc, the Soviet system, Hungary becoming a satellite, and then 1956. And then the 1956 revolution, which was a national social uprising against communism, but especially against the presence of the Soviet troops. And then the Soviets crushed it twice. First, they attempted in October 23rd, and we are about to celebrate the anniversary of the revolution, and the second one decisively on November the 4th. It was a small war. You have to imagine that 2,500 Hungarians and more than 700 Soviet soldiers lost their lives, 10,000 were wounded, and then 200,000 people left this small country as refugees for the West. So it was a huge tragedy, and all was caused by the Soviet Union, in fact. So, and the Soviet Union was mainly made up of Russians, not only them, but Russia was the major player here. So these persons like Viktor Orban had really very, very few motivations to be in favor of Russia, or to be favorable to a tight relationship with Russia. And Orban was consistent with this line until, we can say, 2009. Why 2009? Still in 2008, he was advocating the cause of Georgia after the Saakashvili-led revolution. Georgia entered war, or was invaded by Russia in August 2008, and Orban, as the leader of the Hungarian right-wing opposition at the time, was criticizing bitterly its own government for being not tough enough with Russia and too soft on his stance toward Putin. Then what happened? In November 2009, we know for sure that these two persons met for the first time face-to-face. It was in St. Petersburg at the Congress of United Russia Party. So Putin, who was only prime minister at that time, and of course the president of that party, met Orban, who was the leader of the Hungarian opposition and also the president of Fidesz. We don't know, unfortunately, we don't have minutes, we don't have documents on that meeting, but it is quite clear that something, even in the rhetoric of Viktor Orban towards Moscow, started to change after November 2009. And then we know about the second meeting around the April 2010 elections, which gave Viktor Orban a huge popular and also parliamentary majority and the possibility of building a new system, the so-called system of national cooperation with a new constitution and so on. That building, that meeting was set up not for Orban personally, but for two oligarchs very, very close to him. They went to Moscow, they were taken to Lubyanka building, and they immediately met with top advisors of Putin, who were in fact all people of the secret services. And the aim of the second meeting was very clear. We have some oral stories, we have some interviews about this given later. The purpose of the meeting was setting up a new model of business relationships between Russia and Hungary, so energy and then nuclear plants. Hungary has a Soviet-made nuclear plant, and they were already plans to develop and modernize it in Paks, and so on. So the second meeting was already business-minded and business-like. And then Orban started to speak about opening to the East, which meant China and Russia. We are between 2010, 2011, but at that time, as you know, Ukraine was led by Viktor Yanukovych, so there were no big issues, so everything seemed very, very smooth. When the Euromaidan started in Kyiv and other places in November, December 2013, we could see that the official stance of the Hungarian government was very different from the stance of many other governments in Europe. These governments were mostly sympathetic with the cause of the protesting people, and they were increasingly asking Yanukovych to step back. Meanwhile, the Hungarian official media was portraying these protests very consistently as led, financed, and provoked by the West or by Western agents. And so implicitly, they were portraying the government forces as legitimately defending themselves from an intrusion. And that became very clear in February when Yanukovych was forced to leave, revolution won, and then abruptly so-called small green people started appearing in Crimea and then in the Donbass. And then another argument came, which is very familiar for most Hungarians. The argument was Crimea has always been Russian, so it just was given incidentally to Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev, but Ukraine has nothing to do with Crimea because people are Russians. And as you know, Hungary has also a story of minorities beyond the border. So the national argument or the ethnic argument that Donbass is a Russian-speaking region, so Russian speakers are harassed and persecuted them, so Russia has the right to intervene, was very familiar to Hungarians. So I can trace the origin of what we see now, which is a full-blown Russian collaborationism. I have to be blunt about this, but the origin is a kind of gradual shift in the Hungarian discourse of the right from being anti-Russian because you were anti-Soviet and you are a good Hungarian patriot if you are anti-Russian and anti-Soviet to another one, a totally different one. You are a good Hungarian patriot our way if you are with the Russians against the West. And so now the argument for 1956, for example, which was made recently by some government officials, is the following: we wouldn't have advised Zelensky and his people to resist in February 2022 because we knew from 1956 what happens if you try to resist the Russians. The Russians are, of course, invincible. So implicitly, they said there was a huge error trying to resist the Russians or the Soviets in October, November 1956, because so many people died, so many lives were lost. So they were bringing up this argument that making revolutions or trying to step up against them is just pointless because nothing will help. Of course, there was some outrage in Hungary. There was a big discussion because many people told them, okay, so you are even denying the legacy of 1956, so you are even denying our revolution of dignity. In some cases in Hungary, 1956 is called a kind of revolution of gaining back some dignity after the Second World War, after Holocaust, after losing that part of the 20th century. So you have to see a gradual process, but what we have now, the end of the gradual process, is a very, very clearly crystallized position of being a kind of Russian proxy ideologically in Central Europe.
Well, it does seem like a lot of times that, I'm trying to think of how to pose this question/answer or topic in a way that it makes sense. A lot of the time when for a government it is convenient to sort of impose a new idea onto its people, they use something else as the common enemy. So you made that point, right, where you were a good Hungarian patriot if you were anti-Russian and you loved Hungary, right? And now if you're a good Hungarian patriot, then it doesn't matter. Russia is not really Russia has gone into the background in order to sort of forget about it. And now the problem is the West. But interestingly, Hungary is in the West, right? Hungary is part of the EU. Hungary is part of NATO. Technically, I think Hungary is giving a lot of trouble to the EU and NATO because it's one of the largest consuming of the EU budget's countries and one of the countries that contributes the least. So the idea recently among all of the rest of the EU members has been that Hungary does not have European values, is not interested in European values, and is only continues being in the EU for the money, while allying itself with Russia. What do you think about this? Sorry, your eyebrows went up. It's just I'm not necessarily, I'm just trying to kind of get to the bottom of all the narratives that exist, right? Because
thank you very much. I think it is a very good question, and I can make 2 points out of it. The first is that you are totally right. The Hungarian position here is totally schizophrenic because you speak as you were part of the Euro-Asiatic non-existing confederation, or if you were really part of the community of the Turkish people. You know, Hungary is now belonging to it, so we have been admitted to this fantastic club first as observers and now as full members. So we have this alternative reality in which to place ourselves geopolitically. But yet, everyone knows that Hungary is a long-standing member of both NATO and EU. So what are we looking for, ideologically speaking, in the other camp? And this is what we don't really know. So it is still a puzzling question, and I think even the best analysts have no clear answer. So we know that Orban is a highly rational political actor. Of course, I'm old enough to remember the same things being said about Vladimir Putin. So Putin is such a rational actor that he would never invade a sovereign state and cause a full-blown military invasion, because it would be rationally against his own interests. So we have seen the fate of these very clever predictions. So the clever prediction of today is that, fine, let's consider Viktor Orban a highly rational political actor whose main aim is to stay in power the longest possible time, maybe other 5, 10, 15 years. He's just 61, so plenty of time ahead. What is the best interest for him? The best interest has always been regarded as being a maverick member of the Western world, which means you are inside the club, but you stay in the corner, you shout at the others, but they can't send you out of the door. And this is what happens with both NATO and the EU. The EU, of course, has taken new steps. As you were mentioning, Hungary was a huge EU funds consumer. And now economists calculate that about 20 billion euros are missing from the state budget. So this is the money the EU has started to freeze starting 2 years ago. And, you know, Hungary is not a big country, so 20 billion euro is a lot of money. And the system really lacked them. This is why Hungary is going to the markets. Markets means Qatar, China, other shady places, taking up money for higher interest rates than in the Western markets, like IMF or other organization, or even private banks. But this is the money they geopolitically need in order to pretend not being dependent on the West. Of course they are. And they are deeper and deeper. So, rationally speaking, it would be totally foolish for Orban to provoke the so-called Huxit, which means taking out Hungary of the West. Every opinion poll shows that 70% of the Hungarian population tells us to like the EU. So the EU has a theoretical approval rate of 65-70%, which is higher than the European average. So you have the paradox of a totally non-EU conform and EU hater government leading a country where 65-70% of the population and roughly half of the Fidesz voters as well pretend loving or at least accepting gladly the EU.
Well, it's interesting if I may interject because, the government has a very interesting stance because they hate the EU publicly. They hate everything that the EU stands for, right? The reason why I brought up the consumption of money, right, is because what it looks like at this point, it's like Orban and his government believe that the EU owes them all the money and owes them all of these things, yet don't like anything that's happening in the EU, do not want to conform to the standards of the EU or to what's required of them to be part of the Union. And it's kind of become this one thing where the EU is bad, but give us the money. Like the EU is bad, but support us. And
I think you're correct. And this is precisely what they do. And this is the game they have consistently played for more than 10 years. And it always worked. Now we have a shift. Now we have a new stance. It started during the previous EU Commission. So Ursula von der Leyen and the top EU officers started implementing new policies, basically since the start of the Russian aggression, the full-blown aggression in 2022, and now we see the widespread consequences. So when I see people from Hungarian universities coming to Florence, where I'm sitting now, begging local officers in order to accept Hungarian students who are now banned from Erasmus programs because the former public universities turned almost private, which are almost all Hungarian universities now, are now excluded from EU funding and from these exchange programs. And now these universities were usually very decent people and not necessarily Fidesz people teach and are in higher positions. Now these institutions are in a very bad shape. They are really in trouble, and they are begging their Western partners not to exclude them. I couldn't have imagined such a thing until several years ago. And it is a shame for them. They feel ashamed that we got to this point. What can be worse? They don't know, but they know that everything is getting worse, and they have to defend positions, and they have to defend very, very small privileges and niches of freedom from a central power which is kind of leveling everything.
Do you think so? Interestingly, what do you think is the motivation for Orban to go against the EU and to go against all of the Western nations and to start kind of like going with Russia, right? Like, could it be because, as you said yourself, right? Like, it seems like there was a flip switch a little while ago, like a decade ago. So what's the motivation for Orban to support Russia and to go against, the Union and to go against the interests of all of the allies in Europe? And I know you can't answer it as in like because no one knows what his interest in his head is, but to the best of your ability.
And we don't know what kind of files are contained in some storages in some boxes in Moscow. We don't know. Many people say that there must be something it was probably shown or mentioned him in 2009 during that first famous meeting. It is an educated guess. I think that this guess is 60-70% probable, but I'm a historian, I'm a trained historian. We don't usually we don't know what to do with the 70%, unfortunately. So we can say, okay, it is more than possible, but I can't tell it to you with certainty. So this is something I put on the table as a hypothesis. It is possible there is some compromise on him. Compromise can be something related to the very old past. So the very young Viktor Orban, an opponent of the communist regime in the 1980s, maybe signing something and maybe signing some collaboration, but he was not a communist. But maybe he might have signed under the army something he would regret. Personally, I'm not so excited by this. I think that no one in Hungary can be blackmailed with such an accusations. We have seen examples of people being actual undercover officers, disclosed as undercover officers, gladly taking office, like former Prime Minister Peter Medjes in 2002. So I don't think you can really surprise anyone with such an accusation now in 2024. There might have accusations or blackmails based on corruption. I think that this is more serious and more recent. The Russians have a lot of material on their partners, and they are ready to use it if the partners don't behave the nice way. But we have other two main vectors. The first is business. The Orban-led oligarchs have gained billions of euros in the Russian business. Not only the gas, but the gas business, the gas transit business is basically the major one. So we are speaking about billions of euros. So they have a basic interest in making the Russian connection work, whatever it takes. The second one, or the last one, is ideological convergence. So I think that over the last 15 years, this new Hungarian right came to regard Russia, Putin's Russia, as a viable model of building a centralized, authoritarian, from that point of view, quite well working state. And so they came to regard it pragmatically, not because they are Soviets or communists. As you know, Hungary is no Slavic country, no Orthodox country. So there is no spiritual affiliation between the two people, zero. But there is a lot of money and there is pragmatism. So they came to regard Russia as a model. And you have this more recent connection of Russia exploiting the Orban regime, for example, in campaigns like so-called traditional family. The Congress of World Families, initiated by Russian oligarch Malofeev, had a large basis in Hungary. They even held two congresses, world congresses in Hungary over the last years, and Hungary was one of the promoters of these Russian-led and sponsored organization. And this is only one of the many disinformation or hybrid war campaigns Russia led through Hungary. The other one, for example, is the so-called KGB bank, so the former bank of the Soviet bloc. The Russians resuscitated it over the last 10 years. Hungary decided to become the Central European regional headquarters. So Budapest was placed at the regional headquarters in 2019. Then it took a very strong American advice. The advice was given in May 2023. And the advice was, you have 48 hours to let them go out of the country. Orban understood the message, and those Russians were out in 24 hours, not even 48. But it took a very strong message from Washington, and unfortunately, Washington is sending these messages quite not so often. So they might be a bit more insistent, because we have proof that when you send very loud and very clear messages, these people still tend to listen to you. But when you send ambiguous messages, or they perceive weakness in your message, or that you are undecided, they usually skip them and just ignore them. So I think ideology and business are part of the same path of convergence. So I think that we have different reasons, not a single one.
For sure. Do you think that Russia, and you kind of answered it, answered your opinion, and like based on what's happening in here, but do you think that Russia is using Hungary at this point as a bargaining chip and not as a bargaining chip, but as like an inner agent in order to accomplish its goals within the European Union?
Short answer is yes. I think so. Of course, I'm not an information officer. I'm not a person of the government, so I have no access to any classified information. I spoke to people. I read blogs, newspaper. I listen to podcasts. I try to read through the lines, like in Soviet times. The whole population got used to read through the lines in order to understand secretly send obliquous messages. And this is what we have to do now. This is very interesting that many people in the West forgot how to read through the lines, how to understand what these people are saying without saying it. Maybe because I'm a historian, maybe because I was trained to do so for less recent periods. I'm a historian of the 1950s, 60s in the Soviet bloc, when you had to have this skill in order to survive everything. I developed this skill, and I'm using it now to understand what these people are really up, which is not easy to understand because maybe they don't have a grand strategy build up step by step, and they are just choosing kind of road signs every time with a different purpose. They try to skip difficulties, and then they go right and then left and then they left and they then go back to the main road. So it is a tortuous path, not a linear one. But what we see is that Russia is trying to use Hungary this way. This is absolutely clear. And unlike other countries like Italy, for example, where I'm now, where a not small part, unfortunately, of the media is totally pro-Russian and secretly or not anti-Ukrainian. And we know for sure that a lot of people have been paid to do that. So the Russians are spending a lot of money. My guess is that in Hungary, you don't even have to spend money to get this result, because the Hungarian public media, which is, as you might know, a huge conglomerate of hundreds and hundreds of outlets, TV station, cable station, radio stations, the National Press Agency, internet sites, blogs, whatever, okay, influencers, YouTube channels, whatever you want. All this infosphere put itself at the service of this project on my money as a non-Hungarian taxpayer, but yet spent some time in Hungary. So I spent a lot of money in Hungary indirectly financing the system. So it is our money spent on this project. It is not even Russia's money. I think that you couldn't imagine a better investment. Huge result with very minimal expense.
Yeah, for sure. It's very interesting, right? I mean, all of this is fascinating because you take a country that sort of separated, not sort of, but managed to separate itself from under the claws of the Soviet Union and Russian influence, got into the EU, which is a thing that a lot of post-Soviet satellite spaces only dream of, and had all of these prospects for like a better future, and somehow ended up turning around and regressing backwards 20 years after or 30 years after the collapse of it. So it's a very fascinating case. And I mean, I personally, you know, when people were asking me why did the EU not want Ukraine in the EU in 2008 or 2015, take a side like Angela Merkel and their dealings with Russia, I think it's because they were scared that another Eastern European country could be a liability, because they're already having all of these issues with countries like Hungary or Slovakia or Poland and human rights. And it just seems like our bloc, it's been 30 years, but also we're still a little bit sort of stuck in the old traditions. And it's really sad to see that, because I think that the people don't want the same things as Orban does. And it does seem like his motivations are basically stay in power at whatever cost. And obviously the EU is not going to support that ambition, because that's not how democracies work. And democracy is at the core of the European Union. But Russia can help him with that. And it's it's a really sad sort of change to experience. Do you think that do you think that going further, Hungary is actually going to try and block Ukraine's accession to both NATO and the EU, or is it just a blackmailing chip to get what Hungary wants and sort of like help prolong time for Russia?
Coming to the first part of your questions, it wouldn't be the first time Hungary joins an empire. I consider the EU an empire, a democratic one. Hungary joins an empire or takes part in a positive imperial experience. The first one was the Austro-Hungarian monarchy in the last part of the 19th century, from which Hungary benefited a lot. It was basically the golden age of Greater Hungary. But the same thing happened. Hungary did it, 1867, the compromise with Vienna, and then the nationalists started complaining bitterly that we should be even better, we should be sovereign, we are not sovereign enough, we are losing sovereignty, and so we should separate from Vienna. And the more normal people had a very hard time explaining them that what Hungary just achieved was the best possible compromise and was the best of the worlds. And after the First World War, people had to realize that it was true, that Hungary was great and prosperous and had a lot of opportunities in economic terms because of the empire, because of the Habsburg Empire. So something similar happening now. The whole Hungarian elite worked hard to get into the EU and to get back to the Western track. They were together from the 1980s up to 2004. After reaching 2004, we have what experts call the enlargement fatigue. At one point, you just feel exhausted. It's like, after a hard work day, you just sit, relax, and you don't feel well. You can't relax, and you feel unease. And Hungary started to feel unease that, okay, we are now in the EU, but we are poorer. True. We are peripheric. True. We are not listened. Of course, in these empires, who has a bigger voice? Germany, France, or Hungary, Slovakia, Estonia, whatever. Of course, the bigger ones. Not a big surprise. And so we should get louder. So point is, once you reach a point of equilibrium, the Hungarian elites have the inability to step up and say, okay, what can we do further? No, they try to get back to a previous situation of battle, of conflict, and this is what Orban is doing now. So I'm not sure how long can he resist, or how far can he get with it. But what we have now is a soft Huxit, not a hard one. Soft or partial Huxit means Hungary excluding itself or being excluded by more and more fields of cooperation. The EU, as you know, has no model to expel someone. The Brits did it themselves and then regretted it, but unfortunately it was too late. Orban would never held a referendum to get the country out of the EU, because he knows very well he couldn't win that. So I think that what we see now I don't want to make predictions, but what we already see is the soft hook seat in motion, which means we are out of many fields, educational one, economic ones. Schengen can be suspended, for example, if we continue playing with migrants and smuggling with very nicely state-organized transports, smugglers or migrants from Serbia to Austria or Slovakia to other countries. I think that polices of these states and the governments of these member states have already enough. So they signaled it many times that it is a very nice game, but now it is really time to stop it. And this is a typical Russian game. You see what Belarus is doing now to Poland. And this is a very old trick and a very old story in order to stir up tensions, in order to divide the partners. And Hungary is weighing once again the role of the fool who is fooling the others. But I think once the others stop and say, okay, you have this wonderful Schengen system, which was, I think many Hungarians could agree, one of the biggest achievements of the EU membership. So total personal freedom of movement. And I think you can understand what I say, what would mean now for average Ukrainian people. And if the EU would deny it to Hungary, I think that would be the kind of soft nuclear weapon, even more than money, because money can be maybe replaced. But once you have the borders once again half closed, how can you do it? A good part of the Hungarian population is now set up for this kind of mobile life, which means working in Austria, in border regions, on weekdays, coming back for the weekend, or even daily commuting to other countries. That would become basically impossible.
What do you think? So I guess this is like a good conclusive question. What do you think Ukraine or the EU can do to get Hungary to comply more with the common goals rather than with Russia, if anything?
I'm not a political advisor, for God's sake, but two things might be effective. The first is to make this pressure even harder. So I think that once the system got under pressure starting last year, and they felt it, the opinion polls started to register some shrinking in the approval rate of Orban and of Fidesz. The second one, and I wouldn't like to be too optimistic because every couple of years the so-called Hungarian opposition finds a new messiah and a new god and a new hope for the future, and then it turns out that there was no hope for the future and they are losing again and again. But this new guy, Péter Magyar, seems to be slightly different from the others, paradoxically, because he comes from within the system. He was not outside the system. He precisely knows how the system works, how these people can be blackmailed, harassed, touched. He is tough. I think he has nothing to lose because he jumped out of the system. So he can't go back into the system. He has no way out, personally. And now he built up a virtual community of 35% of votes, which is a lot. No one had been able over the last 15 years to achieve these results. I see one problem, but maybe it is just my too intellectual stance. He shares a very similar political culture like Orban's, which means one leader, one people, one conviction. So he now tells us, believe me, I'm going to lead you again towards Europe. I don't like the idea of having one single opposition force without any other expression. For example, I don't like the idea that the left as such in Hungary has disappeared. We have no left, which is a problem, I think. We have no stronger liberal parties. Peter Magyar is many things, but he's not culturally speaking. He's not a liberal. He's a Christian conservative something, and he can be a decent person, of course, but he's not a liberal. So I think that these forces, which are still in the society, should find a representation in the opposition as well. If they don't, we might have the problem that we replace an Orban with a younger one. Of course, very pragmatically, many Hungarians say everyone would be now better than that actual Orban we have and than this. So first we replace him somehow, and then we start thinking about the future. So we start thinking about, okay, what we can do now to restore confidence in the EU, in the West. Because the issue is really Hungary's position, mentally speaking, so on the mental map. Where are we in the West? Are we in the center? Are we in the East? Are we moved to Asia? No one told us that we just moved back to Asia, from where our opponents always say, oh, you Hungarians are coming from Asia, so you are not even from Europe. And I heard generations of Hungarians bitterly complaining about this, that, oh, the Romanians and the others don't consider us as proper Europeans. They are racist against us. They say, go back to Asia. And now we pretend to go back spontaneously to Asia. So it's time to come back to Europe, where we belong. But what does it mean, Europe? Does it mean always approving what Brussels say? Always telling yes? Maybe not. So we have to start again having a pragmatic and fruitful cooperation with Brussels, which means defending national interest when we have one, but cooperating with the others when we have common issues. So I think that the task is very complex, because we have a political aspect, but the most important, in my view, is the cultural one. We have to convince a good part of the population again that the West is not the enemy, and Ukraine as part of this collective West, even if Ukraine is east of Hungary, geographically speaking, but it is part of the collective West, and Ukraine has to be supported.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's a very good answer. It's really hard, really, to know what to say, or, like, as you said, I'm not a political advisor, right? But it's also like such a tumultuous time that even if you are, it's there's a little too much at stake to kind of try and make make any sort of to do any guesswork. But thank you so much for answering all of the questions, and I hope that the people that are going to watch this are going to understand Hungary a little better and understand sort of the motivations and the reasoning behind what they've been doing lately a little better. And I hope that that'll give them a little bit more of an insight into everything that's happening behind the scenes. So thank you so very much for doing that.
Thank you.
I hope this episode has given you a window of insight into how Orban thinks and why Hungary is acting the way it is acting, because it certainly has helped me to understand a lot of things I might have not understood before, and definitely provided me with some very new information. This segment aims to put out fires, but we normally end up setting things on fire and causing a lot of different debates and conversations, which honestly we love, because the more people talk about it, the more people talk about it, and the more Ukraine is in the news and in the discussions. So if you enjoyed this segment and you would like to hear a lot more like this, and you would like to hear from more amazing speakers, please don't forget to sign up for The Gaze, or I guess on YouTube we say subscribe to The Gaze. And also don't forget to like this video and send it to friends, because you never know who else might be interested in these conversations. And, of course, please do leave us a comment and write your opinion, or maybe you have some questions or suggestions. I read all of them, and I'm always happy to hear from you. See you next week.